36 times. That is the exact number of times Bumpy Johnson's blade found its mark in a single, lightning-fast Harlem restaurant brawl. In the sweltering summer of 1935, the Alhambra was packed with 200 witnesses who expected a night of jazz but instead witnessed a masterclass in surgical violence. By cut number 12, the 240-pound Chicago hitman Ulysses Rollins was already a broken man. By cut 24, he was permanently blinded. By the final 36th cut, the room was so silent you could hear the blood hit the floor. But it wasn't the carnage that made the story legendary, it was what Bumpy did next. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He simply stood up, adjusted his silk tie, and stepped over the mutilated body like it was nothing more than a puddle in the street. He walked back to his table, sat down, and calmly told the trembling waiter he wanted a plate of spaghetti. This was more than a fight. It was a cold-blooded message to the Italian Mafia that Harlem belonged to Bumpy Johnson. In the summer of 1935, Harlem was a powder keg of racial and criminal tension. Two unstoppable forces were moving toward a collision. On one side was Dutch Schultz, a German Jewish mobster who controlled a massive chunk of the New York underworld. Schultz was greedy. He wanted total control of Harlem's lucrative numbers racket and didn't care how many black bodies he had to step over to get it. Opposing him was 30-year-old Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, an enforcer for the numbers queen, Madame Stephanie St. Clair. Bumpy had made a solemn vow, Harlem stays black, no matter the cost. While Schultz had the resources of a massive syndicate, Bumpy had the loyalty of the streets. Schultz had already sent dozens of men into the neighborhood, but Bumpy's crew of 9 had been picking them off one by one. It was easy for Bumpy to spot the invaders, as few white men walked Harlem streets during the day. Desperate and losing ground, Schultz decided to stop sending soldiers and instead sent a monster. To break the stalemate, Dutch Schultz called in a specialist from Chicago, Ulysses Rollins. Standing 6 feet 2 inches and weighing 240 pounds of pure muscle and scar tissue, Rollins was a human wrecking ball. In the Midwest, they called him the Bull, because his charge was considered unstoppable. By his 25th birthday, he had already claimed the lives of 11 men. Schultz paid him $5,000 upfront with a $10,000 bonus if he could eliminate Bumpy Johnson. The instructions were specific: make it loud. Make it public. Schultz wanted every numbers runner in Harlem to witness the consequences of resisting his empire. Rollins arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, the entire neighborhood knew a new executioner was in town looking for the Godfather of Harlem. Rollins assumed he was the predator, stalking a target in unfamiliar territory, but he fundamentally misunderstood the environment he had just entered. He was walking into a community that protected its own, and he was being watched from the moment he stepped off the train. What Rollins didn't realize was that in Bumpy's Harlem, every citizen was a lookout. The shoeshine boys, the newspaper vendors, and the women selling flowers were all part of Bumpy's intelligence network. By Friday morning, Bumpy didn't just know Rollins was in town. He knew his hotel, his breakfast order, and exactly what he was carrying: a .45 caliber pistol in a shoulder holster and a knife hidden in his boot. Bumpy also knew that Rollins was actively shadowing him, waiting for the perfect public moment to strike. Instead of hiding, Bumpy decided to give the hitman exactly what he wanted: a public appearance. He scheduled a date with Helen Lawson, a sophisticated white editor and film critic for Vanity Fair. Helen was fascinated by Bumpy, seeing him as a complex figure who represented the Harlem Renaissance rather than just crime. Bumpy suggested dinner at the Alhambra Bar and Theater, a legendary spot where jazz royalty like Duke Ellington performed. He was leading the Bull into a trap of his own making, disguised as a knight of high society. Bumpy arrived at the Alhambra at 8 p.m. looking more like a banker than a gangster. He wore a charcoal gray suit, a burgundy tie, and shoes polished to a mirror shine. Helen sat across from him in a blue dress and pearls. The atmosphere was electric. The jazz quartet played soft music while 200 of Harlem's elite dined and laughed. Bumpy and Helen discussed his childhood in Charleston and her struggles as one of the few women in a high-level publishing role. Bumpy was a man of contradictions, quoting poetry and discussing intellectuals like Langston Hughes while knowing that a killer was closing in. At 8:47 p.m., the door swung open, and Rollins walked in. Bumpy saw him instantly. The way he scanned the room like a predator told Bumpy everything he needed to know. Helen noticed the shift immediately. The charming gentleman vanished, replaced by something cold and hard. When she asked if something was wrong, Bumpy simply replied, "Everything's fine," and excused himself. Rollins moved through the tables with deliberate arrogance, relishing the attention. He wanted the execution to be a spectacle. When he reached Bumpy's table, he loomed over the seated man, attempting to assert dominance. "Dutch Schultz sends his regards," Rollins announced loudly, making sure the surrounding diners heard. "Says you've been a problem. Says problems need to be solved." The jazz music continued, but the chatter died out as the room realized a hit was about to happen. Bumpy remained eerily calm. "Tell Dutch," Bumpy replied, "that Harlem already solved its problem with him. He just doesn't know it yet." Rollins laughed, reaching for the .45 in his jacket. Bumpy realized that if Rollins drew the gun in such a crowded room, innocent people, including Helen and the musicians, would likely be caught in the crossfire. To save the room, Bumpy decided he had to move first, and he had to be final. The violence that followed was so fast that most witnesses only saw the aftermath. Bumpy didn't reach for a gun. He reached for the 6-inch serrated steak knife beside his dinner plate. He exploded from his chair with non-human speed. The first cut sliced Rollins's forearm as he reached for his pistol, causing the gun to clatter harmlessly to the floor. The second cut opened the hitman's cheek. Rollins, despite his size, was completely overwhelmed. They crashed into a nearby table, shattering glass and scattering food, but Bumpy's movements remained precise and calculated. Helen watched from the wall as the man she had just been talking poetry with systematically dismantled a giant. It wasn't a display of rage, it was a display of mathematics. The knife was an extension of Bumpy's hand, finding flesh every time Rollins tried to swing back. By cut 18, Rollins's shoulder was open. By cut 24, he was on his knees. The final stage of the fight was the most gruesome. As Rollins knelt broken on the floor, Bumpy delivered cut number 25. The blade went deep above Rollins's left eye, and when Bumpy pulled it back, the eyeball was destroyed, causing permanent and irreversible blindness. Rollins's screams filled the silent restaurant, a sound that would haunt Helen Lawson's nightmares for years. The jazz quartet had stopped. 200 people stood frozen like statues, watching a scene out of a horror story. Bumpy stood over the whimpering, broken hitman, his own clothes stained with blood that wasn't his. Then, with the entire room watching, Bumpy did something that sent a chill through everyone present. He reached down and calmly straightened his tie. The gesture was so deliberate and businesslike that it proved Bumpy hadn't lost control for even a second. He stepped over Rollins's body as if it were a common puddle and walked back to his table. Bumpy uprighted his fallen chair and sat back down. He looked at a shell-shocked Helen and smiled the same charming smile from earlier. "I apologize for the interruption," he said quietly. He then signaled the waiter, who was paralyzed with fear behind the bar. "Could we get some menus? I seem to have worked up an appetite." When the waiter failed to move, Bumpy grabbed a menu from a nearby table and decided, "I suddenly have a taste for spaghetti and meatballs." While the ambulance sirens began to wail outside, Bumpy calmly wiped the blood from his hands with a napkin. When the pasta arrived, he ate slowly and deliberately, enjoying the meal as medics loaded the mutilated Rollins onto a stretcher. The police arrived shortly after, but they knew Bumpy was the law in Harlem. They ruled it self-defense, as Rollins had drawn a weapon first. By the next morning, the spaghetti incident was a legend. Chapter 9. The Godfather's Legacy. The news of the Alhambra bloodbath reached Dutch Schultz by noon the following Saturday. His lieutenant arrived white-faced, reporting that their prize hitman was in the hospital, cut to pieces and missing an eye. Schultz, realizing the psychological war was lost, famously told his men to leave Harlem alone, noting that they had already lost 40 men to a neighborhood where Bumpy Johnson wasn't even breathing hard. This single night of calculated violence forced a historic shift in New York's power structure. Schultz reached out to Lucky Luciano to negotiate a deal that would eventually make Bumpy the first black man to sit at the table as an equal with the Italian Mafia. Bumpy would go on to rule Harlem for the next 30 years, protecting everyone from Madame St. Clair to Malcolm X. He proved that real power isn't just the capacity for violence, it is the absolute control to destroy an enemy and then calmly straighten your tie and finish your dinner. To this day, the legend of the 36 cuts stands as the moment Harlem learned that its protector was something colder and more dangerous than any outside force could ever imagine. Chapter 9. The Godfather's Legacy. The news of the Alhambra bloodbath reached Dutch Schultz by noon the following Saturday. His lieutenant arrived white-faced, reporting that their prize hitman was in the hospital, cut to pieces and missing an eye. Schultz, realizing the psychological war was lost, famously told his men to leave Harlem alone, noting that they had already lost 40 men to a neighborhood where Bumpy Johnson wasn't even breathing hard. This single night of calculated violence forced a historic shift in New York's power structure. Schultz reached out to Lucky Luciano to negotiate a deal that would eventually make Bumpy the first black man to sit at the table as an equal with the Italian Mafia. Bumpy would go on to rule Harlem for the next 30 years, protecting everyone from Madame St. Clair to Malcolm X. He proved that real power isn't just the capacity for violence, it is the absolute control to destroy an enemy and then calmly straighten your tie and finish your dinner. To this day, the legend of the 36 cuts stands as the moment Harlem learned that its protector was something colder and more dangerous than any outside force could ever imagine. Don't miss the next legend. If this story of Bumpy Johnson's ice-cold precision moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We drop these untold stories of Harlem's most powerful figures every single week, and trust me, the next one is even crazier. Drop a comment below. Would you have the nerves to sit there and order spaghetti after what Bumpy just did? Turn on notifications now, because next week we're revealing the secret details of the time Bumpy walked into Lucky Luciano's office alone to change the mafia forever. Remember, in Harlem, respect wasn't given, it was earned.